What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. This video is the instant main eventers, WWE's fastest track pushes. This video is suggested by Ali Anderson, so thank you, Anderson. Sorry. So thank you for the suggestion. If you guys have any other suggestions, please put them in the comment section down below or on my post on my channel. And yeah, let's get into it.
Sometimes a
Let's make
wrestler's
this
journey
louder.
towards becoming a main eventer can be a long and arduous one which sees them spend years toiling away on the indie scene, only to, years later, finally get the opportunity they've been waiting for. Other times, it can be the exact opposite, as for one reason or another, a performer can find themselves being fast-tracked right to the top of the card. And while the reasons for this can vary, it's generally done on account of that person being so naturally talented, they simply can't be ignored. But what are some
We do have a lot of WWE reaction requests. So
of the best examples of
I appreciate you guys posting requests.
this in action? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into instant main eventers.
But do please keep in mind, like, if a certain video is too much for my liking, or there would be other reasons why I probably wouldn't react to something. I appreciate the request reaction, but sometimes certain videos
Wrestlers who were fast-tracked to the top.
I like watching WWE videos.
And if we're starting anywhere, we really should start with the man who, in many
it gets to a point sometimes.
ways, set the gold standard for someone coming into the industry as a rookie, only to then become a world-class talent in record time, and that's Kurt Angle. Yes, after winning a gold medal in amateur wrestling with what was effectively a broken neck at the 1996 Olympic Games, just about every pro wrestling company in the world had their eyes on the All-American hero as they hoped to woo him in with promises of further fame and fortune. In the end, though, it was Vince McMahon who provided the best offer to Kurt, as in 1998 he'd sign on the dotted line with the WWF. But of course, it was initially expected that he'd need a few years to get ring ready at this point. But to the surprise of everyone, Angle took to the sport so quickly he'd be prepared to hit the main roster less than a year later. With him here rising up the card at such a rapid rate, he'd be world
When he joined, was it WWE or F?
champion by the autumn of 2000.
Or when he debuted?
That's right. Up until then, no one had gone through a rookie year quite like the Olympic gold medal winner. And while part of this was the boss's desire to give him the mega push right out of the gate, an even bigger part of it was that Angle was just so damn good. It made no sense to have him in the mid-card any longer. But how could they? After all, with no prior experience as a pro wrestler before entering a WWF ring, Kurt had gotten so good so quickly he was able to become arguably the best wrestler on the roster by the turn of the millennium. An impressive feat, considering this was a roster which by then included the likes of Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, and Chris Jericho. And of course, after being shot right to the top, that's where Angle would remain for the rest of his career, with him becoming a 5-time WWE World Champion, 6-time TNA World Champion, and 1-time unofficial IWGP World Champion by the time his career was over. That said, for as excellent as a rookie year he had, this would arguably be one-upped by a man who debuted just a few years after him and who would go on to become one of the Olympic hero's greatest rivals. Who are we talking about here? Why, Brock Lesnar, of course. Yes, if Kurt Angle's rise was meteoric, then the Beasts must have broken the light barrier itself, because no one in the history of WWE has ever risen quite as high as he did, quite as fast. How did he do this? Well, after proving himself to be a once-in-a-generation athlete during his time as an amateur wrestler in the late 90s, Brock would be scouted by Gerald Briscoe and signed up to a WWE developmental contract in late 2000. And there, amongst a class which included the likes of John Cena, Dave Bautista, Randy Orton, and Shelton Benjamin, Lesnar would stand out so much that come March of 2002, he'd have been moved up to the main roster, where he began destroying everyone in his path. Of course, at this point he was still a rookie in the ring, and so, the obvious booking choice would have been to ease him into an upper mid-card spot with some big wins, gradually building him up to the point he could become a world champion somewhere down the line. For the Beast, though, this simply wasn't acceptable, and so instead, he'd get so over so quickly that the WWE were left with no choice but to push him to the moon by having him win the King of the Ring that June. and as a result of this, he'd find himself in the position of being the #1 contender to the WWE Undisputed Championship,
I think
then being
I'm gonna know all these because I do know Kurt Angle, Brock Lesnar.
held by The Rock at that August SummerSlam. But while there were those who felt that this was too much too soon for the youngster, he would ultimately go on to prove them all wrong when, at the biggest show of the summer, just 5 months after his main roster debut, Brock would defeat the Great One in convincing fashion and become the youngest ever WWE champion at that time. Needless to say then, after that, he was a made man and would remain a main eventer all the way up until he quit the company in 2004. And when he'd returned again years later after having conquered the world of MMA, he'd be an even bigger star, one who arguably still stands as the final boss of wrestling to this day. Of course, Brock wasn't the first monster heel who had been brought into WWE and given the world title early on in his run though, as years before this, back when the company was still called the WWF, a young Rodney Anoa'i was given a similar spot when he took up the role of Yokozuna. Now for some context, back then, Vince McMahon had very much been running a... By 1992, however, with it becoming clear that Hulkamania was on the way out, the boss decided to try something different when he had his new top heel in waiting become the dominating force for a while instead. It all started with Yokozuna's debut in October of that year, as here, he'd portray himself as a Japanese sumo champion who'd come to America looking for the best competition. And quickly finding he was able to beat the WWF competition with ease, he'd rise up the card so fast that by the time it got to the Royal Rumble the following January, he'd have no problem winning the whole thing. Of course, as a result of this, he earned the right to face then WWF champion.
You see what he's doing? Look at what he's doing. By the time it
got to beat the WWF competition with ease, he'd rise up the card so fast that by the time it got to the Royal Rumble,
slamming on people's chests and then sitting,
the following
just
January,
saying there,
he'd have no problem winning the whole thing.
Yeah, no problem.
Of course, as a result of this, he'd earned the right to face then WWF champion Bret Hart at WrestleMania 9, with this bout being billed as the biggest challenge the Hitman had faced to date. But while Hart would put on a valiant babyface effort that night, in the end,
just
Yokozuna
casually making sure that they can't breathe.
Too much to overcome, and by the time the closing bell rang, he'd be the new world champion. That said, things get a little muddy after this because, with Hulk Hogan interjecting himself into the situation, he'd end up walking out of the arena that night as champion instead. Still, by the time we got to the King of the Ring in June, things would be back on track, and Yoko would start an almost year-long run as the top dog in New York, a feat which was almost unheard of for a villain at that time. As the years have gone on, however, this has proved to be a successful formula which Vince McMahon has been able to return to again and again. And perhaps no more prominent example of this existed in the mid-2000s than the time the great Khali was rocketed to the top of the card when he became world champion himself. Why Khali? Well, one look at him should explain this, as with him standing 7 foot 3 inches in height and looking like the second coming of Andre the Giant, it was
obvious like a giant.
Vince McMahon was going to push him to the moon as soon as he laid eyes on him. And this push would begin manifesting itself in early 2006 as, with Daivari by his side acting as a mouthpiece, the Indian native would start mowing through the SmackDown roster with ease. The only problem with this, though, was that, unlike Andre the Giant before him, Khali was never a great wrestler, and so his matches were often amongst the weakest on the card. That said, it didn't stop him being treated like any less of a superstar in his home country. And that was partially why, by 2007, he'd have joined the ranks of the greats when he became World Heavyweight Champion. Of course, sometimes a big push right out of the gate isn't about winning the world title. No, sometimes it's about putting on a performance so impressive that the person in question can't be kept out of the main event scene, even if it's only their third match. And if you want any evidence of this, you just have to look to what Logan Paul did in 2022. Yes, while to a percentage of the population,
how is this guy? Okay.
Logan Paul might be the biggest real-life heel on the internet. The fact that he's taken to wrestling faster than anyone since Kurt Angle can't really be denied at this point. After all, in his first 2 matches with the company, the first of which was a tag match where he and The Miz took on the Mysterios, and the second of which was a singles match with The Miz himself, he'd show himself to be something of a prodigy. And even if this wasn't enough to get him cheered by fans, it wasn't.
Yeah, but he was already known on social
Enough
media.
for
So.
WWE to feel confident in having him main event the November 5th, 2022 Crown Jewel show, there challenging Roman Reigns for the undisputed WWE title. But while he may not have won this one, he was able to put on a performance which made him look like a seasoned veteran after less than a year in the ring, suggesting he has a big run in him with WWE in the future if he chooses to do so. That said, if he wants to stay at the top of the WWE card, he'd better keep himself in top shape, because he's soon going to have some competition in the form of one of NXT's fastest rising stars, Braun Breaker. That's right, anyone who's kept tuning into the developmental brand following the end of the Black and Gold era will know that,
too.
while there are a number of young prospects out there who look
I know everybody so far.
set to rise to the level of stardom in the future, none of these are more prominent than Braun. And that's because, as the son of Rick Steiner, he's clearly got this in his genes, something which is evident by just how good he's gotten so quickly. In fact, despite only being signed to the company in February of 2021, he's already become a two-time NXT World Champion, with his first reign starting less than a year after his debut when he pinned Tommaso Ciampa for the honor. And since then, he's gone through everyone who's been put in his way, whether this be fellow developmental talents such as Santos Escobar, Joe Gacy, or Ilya Dragunov, or more established main roster acts like Dolph Ziggler. So it should go without saying that it's only a matter of time before he finally hits the main roster, and when he does, if he carries on with this same trajectory, there's every possibility he'll be a world champion there too soon enough. But he'll have some tough competition to contend with once he makes it to the big leagues, of course, perhaps none of whom are as formidable as someone who was fast-tracked to the main event scene when he first debuted in 2016, and that's AJ Styles. Of course, before he ever hit a WWE ring, AJ Styles was already well established as one of the best wrestlers in the world, what with his lengthy runs in both TNA and New Japan Pro Wrestling, where he became a multiple-time world champion. That said, given his relative small size and the fact that he hadn't been created in the WWE system, there was still some concerns that, when he finally did join Vince McMahon's roster in the mid-2010s, the boss wouldn't want to push him as a top-level guy. And as it happens, it's since come out that this was indeed the initial plan, with AJ having been slotted in the position of a dependable upper mid-card act who could put on a great match with anyone, similar to the role Dolph Ziggler has. This would all change, however, when, after seeing his work and realizing he had the second coming of Shawn Michaels on his hands, Vince would have no choice but to push Styles to the moon. Yes, after only a few months on the roster, the former IWGP champion would be challenging Roman Reigns for the top prize on Raw, and taking him to the limit while he was at it. But even if he hadn't succeeded in beating the big dog here, AJ would still get to have a career-defining trilogy of matches against John Cena that summer, with these proving to be so good that it now became undeniable he was a top star in waiting. Hell, at one point he'd even beaten Cena clean, something which almost no one ever did. So with all the momentum in the world behind him then, Styles would make the jump over to SmackDown in August and quickly earn himself the spot of #1 contender to Dean Ambrose's WWE title. Of course, this time there would be no coming up short for the Phenomenal One, and so, by the time the closing bell had rung during the eventual title match between the two at September 11th's Backlash, he'd have become the new world champion, a role he would continue to hold on to for the next 140 days. But for as quick a rise as AJ Styles had in 2016, even it can't compare to what a fellow Bullet Club member had undergone at the exact same time. And that's because in the case of Finn Balor, it took him less than a month to reach the top of the mountain. Sure, prior to this, Balor had already gone through a 292-day run as NXT World Champion, and prior to that, he'd been a star player in New Japan Pro Wrestling, where he'd founded the Bullet Club. That said, like AJ, with him being relatively short in size and not having been created in the WWE system, there were concerns that Vince McMahon wouldn't go all the way with him once he joined the main roster in August of 2016. So it came as a very pleasant surprise to everyone then when, on night one, Balor would score the win of a lifetime when he pinned Golden.
Like I said, I used to watch WWE, but not as much anymore. So after I feel like after 2013, 2014, anybody who debuted after that time, I won't know them.
Boy Roman Reigns clean in the middle of the ring. and as a result of this victory, he'd earn himself a shot at becoming the first ever Universal Champion when he faced off against Seth Rollins at SummerSlam later that month. But while Rollins...
I mean, I did start watching WWE kinda because of these videos, so like the more recent people,
far
I
more
don't know.
established of the two at this point, with him being a former WWE champion himself already. It would be the Irishman who ultimately proved all his doubters wrong when, after just under 20 minutes, he was able to pin the Architect and become the inaugural holder of the newly established belt. Unfortunately, though, it would be in this very bout in which things also started to go wrong for Balor, as after a botched move mid-match saw him dislocate his shoulder, he'd be forced to vacate the title the next night on Raw. And while he would eventually come back from this injury, he'd never quite be able to reach the same level again. Still, the fact that he was pushed so hard so fast was very telling about how talented Vince McMahon thought he was. And with him now gaining a prominent spot in Triple H's new regime as the leader of the Judgment Day, who knows when he might end up getting that world title back around his waist again. But he's not the only Irishman in WWE who's vying to return to the title scene once more. And that's because over on SmackDown, there's a man who has been doing this since 2009. And back then, he was able to establish himself as a top guy pretty much right away. Who are we talking about this time? Why, Sheamus, of course. How did he manage to rise so high so fast? Well, by being pretty much everything Vince McMahon was looking for in a top star at the time.
Yeah, I know Sheamus.
After all, he was big, he was muscular, and he could put on a solid WWE-style main event match. On top of that, it also helped that he had friends in high places, as, being a gym buddy of Triple H's, he was able to get to know the heir to the company on a more personal level. So all this would come together then to allow him to rocket up the card fast after his debut on June 30th of that year.
Damn.
In fact, so quick would this rise be that, by October,
there's no pads. There's no pads under that. That's just straight floor, guys.
Royal to earn himself
Y'all know
a
that,
shot
but
at the WWE
that
title.
shit still surprises
And
me.
realizing this represented the opportunity of a lifetime then, the Irishman would take this and run with it for all it was worth, as when his subsequent match with then champion John Cena came at December 13th's Tables, Ladders, and Chairs pay-per-view, he'd do what few thought he was capable of and defeat Big Match John to take home the gold. And sure, he hadn't actually pinned the champ, as this title change had occurred during a tables match, but that didn't make it any less legitimate. So from there then, Sheamus would pretty much be a made man for the rest of his career, with him always filling a prominent spot on the expectations on his shoulders. After all, this is something which can make it particularly difficult for someone to succeed to a high level. When it comes to our next entry, however, pressure only seemed to make her stronger, as despite being better known for her time in the Octagon rather than the Squared Circle, when Ronda Rousey joined WWE in 2018, she'd take to it like a duck to
See,
water.
I didn't even know that.
Yes, after making a couple of cameo
Didn't even know that she was
appearances with
in
the
the
company throughout the
WWE.
prior years, there was many a rumor swirling about Rousey joining Vince McMahon's company once she retired from the world of MMA.
You know how they have like guests come on WWE? Because I know that they had Snoop Dogg and other people. I thought it was that sort of situation, but I didn't know she.
And all this speculation was
joined
ultimately put to
WWE.
bed when, after the 2018 Women's Royal Rumble match, she'd make an appearance and announce that she had indeed joined the roster full-time. So from there, all eyes were on her as people waited patiently to see how well she would do in the ring. And as it happened, the answer to this question was that she would do brilliantly, because in her first official match at WrestleMania 34, she arguably stole the show. Of course, this was a tag team bout, so she did have other ring generals like Triple H and Kurt Angle in there with her to help her out. But this didn't mean she needed much of a safety net. No, quite the opposite in fact, because when she started doing singles matches soon after this against the likes of Nia Jax and Alexa Bliss, she'd carry herself like someone who'd been doing this for years. That's right, you could argue that, by this point, she was actually better than many of her opponents, and so that was why, by August 19th SummerSlam, she'd have become Raw Women's Champion.
She's was a UFC fighter.
Then from there,
Of course, she'll have some knowledge on.
was off to the races as, over the subsequent months, the combination of Ronda's star power mixed with the meteoric rise of Becky Lynch would elevate the WWE's women's division to the point where, at WrestleMania 35, the first ever women's main event would take place between Rousey, Lynch, and Charlotte Flair. But the former UFC bantamweight champion wasn't the first person to see a quick rise to the main event scene earn her a WrestleMania main event. And that's because, way back in 1990, Sergeant Slaughter would find himself in such a position too after returning to the WWF and jumping to the dark side. In this incident, however, his jump...
This is the last person on the list for instant main eventers. Who is your... If you guys did make it this far, hello. Who's your favorite out of everybody on this list? Who's your favorite
proved to be pretty
main eventer?
Controversial, because despite being treated like an American hero in the years prior, so much so that he'd even become a character in the G.I. Joe toy line, when he returned at the turn of the decade, he'd switch allegiances and join sides with the opposition. Yes, this was right smack in the middle of the first Gulf War, and so, wanting to play up to the whole thing on TV, Vince McMahon would rebrand Slaughter as an Iraqi sympathizer who had turned his back on his homeland. Of course, this drew huge amounts of heat from audiences, with things getting so bad that at one point, Sarge would have to come down to the ring wearing bulletproof vests over fears someone might try to take a shot at him. But even this wasn't enough to deter him from going after the top dog in the company at the time, as, in January of 1991, only 5 months after his return, he'd find himself going up against then WWF champion, The Ultimate Warrior. And despite the Warrior being the clear favorite to win this one, it would end up being Slaughter who pulled off the upset and took home the belt for himself come the end of things. So this then would lead to the real American hero Hulk Hogan challenging the new champ for both the belt and the honor of his country at WrestleMania 7 that March. The only problem with this, however, was that, well, the kind of storyline might have worked better a few years prior. In 1991, with there being an actual war going on, many found the whole thing too distasteful, and so Mania 7 would end up drawing far less than anticipated, so much that it would have to be moved to a smaller venue at one point. Still, none of this changed the fact that after spending years playing the hero to the people, it wouldn't be until he made a surprise return to WWF as a villain that Sergeant Slaughter would finally get his due and rise to the main event scene. So maybe there's a lesson to be taken from that then. If you want to reach the top, you might have to make some sacrifices. After all, as we've seen today, pretty much everyone we've looked at has had to do this in some form or another. Yes, whether it be a brutal Olympic training schedule, a career in the octagon, or building a name for yourself over in Japan, overnight success takes a long time to achieve.
Yes, it does. That is true. I love these videos. They're very entertaining. They go by so quick. Yeah. Is there a part 2 to this video? If there is, let me know, and I'll eventually watch it. I know it takes a week or a couple of weeks for me to react to something. But yes, please be patient. But yeah, if you guys did enjoy this video, please give it a like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.